Good afternoon. Welcome to the webinar Understanding Newcomer Experiences of Inclusion presented by Center for Race and Culture. Thank you for tuning in. We are very happy to have you. It's pretty breezy, windy here in Edmonton, but I hope everyone is staying healthy and well. We have a lot to cover in the next hour. But a couple of housekeeping items. My name is Ria from Reach Edmonton, Council for Safe Communities. Reach and Center for Race and Culture have been working together in the past few years, especially around development and delivery of cultural competency workshops to frontline workers and wider community. And we're during this pandemic, we're also especially happy to partner up with these webinars and to support the work they do and to share the work they do with wider community members. So a few things from me. We have chat box and Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom window. If you have anything, any questions related to the contents, questions for the presenters, you can use the Q&A and type your questions. Or if you have anything else related or unrelated with anything, you can use the chat box and I'll be watching over the questions and comments. We will have Q&A time aside at the end for 50 minutes or so. So we'll get to that later on. And we will also have a few links pop up in the chat box. So you can actually go ahead and open the chat box. I will be posting some links as we go. And also please we might be having a little bit of audio issue, but we will be recording the presentations and slides, and the transcript will be shared later on. So if you please bear with us with the technical glitches, that would be great. I think that is all from me. I will pass it over to Miriam and Rose Eva. Thank you so much, both of you, for being here and sharing your research.
Thank you so much, Rie.
Thank you, Rie. So I want to say good afternoon to everyone and welcome to our webinar on our finding of the Newcomer Experiences of Inclusion Research Project in Alberta. And thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. So in this webinar, webinar will be long, and then 15 minutes Q&A are and then I'll be posting as well, as Rie mentioned. So in the next slide, we want to mention that this project is funded by the Government of Alberta, Alberta Labour, and it is being carried out by us at the Center for Race and Culture, or CFRAC for short. Just so that everyone's aware, we'll be using the term CFRAC in the rest of the presentation. So by CFRAC, we just mean the Center for Culture. And we also wanted to thank Edmonton and Clayton and Rie for their generous support in hosting this webinar with us. And next slide. So even though we might not be gathered in the same physical space together, for this presentation, I think it's still important to acknowledge the land that I myself am occupying today and acknowledge the land that CFRAC operates on. So we would like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which we gather today is Treaty 6 territory, the traditional homelands for many Indigenous peoples, including Nehio, Saulteaux, Niitsitapi, Métis, Dene, and Nakota. With this acknowledgement, we pay our respects to the ancestors past and present who call this land home, and remind all of us gathered here today of the responsibilities we have as treaty people to understand our shared colonial history and work together towards a just future that includes. I also wanted to take this time to acknowledge that the reason that we're doing this presentation as a webinar is due to COVID disproportionately affects Indigenous people. Dallas Hunt and Gina Starblanket co-wrote a Globe and Mail article that's entitled Indigenous Communities and COVID-19. The virus doesn't discriminate, but responses to it do. So I would highly recommend that article, and I think the link is going to be in the chat box for folks to check out. Another article I would highly recommend is the one that you can see on the slide right here that's entitled Indigenous Communities and Bad COVID Data by Courtney Skye, which can be found on the Yellowhead Institute article box for folks. Their article Institute is a First Nation-led think tank that I would highly recommend to check out their other publications as well. And I'll also be talking about this article in particular later on in the presentation and how it's related to some of the challenges that we had as well in our research. So just to give you a quick outline, in this webinar, first we'll introduce ourselves and tell you a bit more about the Center for Race and Culture. And next we will introduce a bit of the general data on newcomers in Canada and Alberta, as well as some current trends and research to provide context for our project. And we will then provide information on the background of our project and discuss some of our preliminary findings and finish off with some of the next steps that we're hoping to achieve. So if you have any questions throughout this webinar, please write them down as we go along, and then we'll answer them in the question and answer portion. We have 15 minutes set aside for that at the end. And also letting you know that throughout the webinar, we'll be conducting 2 very brief polls, and these should take no longer than 1 minute each. And that's just to get a better understanding of who today's participants are. And at the end of the at the end of the webinar, we'll also ask for your feedback by sending out a link to our feedback form. That's just to get a better understanding of who. So we would also like to point out that the findings that we're going to discuss during this webinar are based on the data that we've collected so far. And due to the relatively short time frame we had to conduct our research, these results are not as in-depth and fully developed as they will be in the final analysis and report. So there are still many questions arising from our data, which we will seek to address and answer. But at the same time, our preliminary findings have flagged a number of interesting areas and correlations, which will guide us to the second stage of our data, and we're very excited to share that with you today. So on this slide, you can see that we've listed some of the amazing organizations and agencies that have helped us conduct our research. And we would not have been able to do our research without our connections in the community. So we would like to take this opportunity to thank them specifically. Without your enthusiasm and support, we would not have been able to undertake our research. And of course, we would like to say a big heartfelt thank you to our research participants who took the time to complete our online survey, sometimes even without claiming their gift card. And last but not least, we would like to thank those who freely shared their experiences with us in the interviews and focus groups. So on the next slide, we're going to talk a little bit more about the Center for Race and Culture. So CFRAC was established in 1993, and it was formerly known as Northern Alberta Alliance for Race Relations. And CFRAC promotes and supports individual, collective, and systemic change to address discrimination and racism and encourage intercultural understanding. Taking an intersectional approach, our expertise spans workplace development, building, research. And then if you have any questions, feel free to contact us at info@cfrac.com or any of those links there. And next slide is free to. So I'll let Miriam introduce herself.
Yes, hello everyone. My name is Miriam Gerber. I'm the research coordinator for this project since August last year. My background is in education, and I'm currently completing my PhD program at Concordia University in Montreal. I came to Canada myself 20 years ago, and I'm a settler here on Treaty 6 land.
And to tell you a bit about myself, my name is Rose Eva Forks Jenkins. My video is turned off, I think, because the connection was not great, but you can see a picture of me there when I was in Toronto. So I've been with the Center for Race and Culture since March 2018. I previously worked on the podcast project where I traveled across Canada, and that's where that picture was taken. And I've been working on this project as a research assistant since May of 2019. And I'm also a settler here on Treaty 6 territory, and I've grown up in Edmonton most of my life. So we also want to thank some other folks who are on the team. So we have Ellie Denavi, who's Center for Race and Culture's Executive Director, who oversaw the project as project manager. And we would also like to take this opportunity to thank CFRAC's former Executive Director, Vanessa DeConnick, who developed the original project proposal and who kindly agreed to work with us on this preliminary data analysis. And then finally, we would like to thank Mansouri Modares, who did the design of this presentation and did some of the graphic images as well. So we thank her a lot for her talents. So on the next slide, we will conduct our first brief poll. So the answers should pop up, and then you can answer them. And this should take not too long, maybe a minute or so. And this will help us get a better understanding of our audience. Okay, great. So we have our results. So 68% of folks responding do work as service providers, and 32% do not. And then have your organization shared information about our projects? 46% of you have, and 54% of you have not. So thank you so much for telling us a little bit about yourselves. And so next on, we're going to provide some general information about newcomers to Canada and Alberta.
Yes, thank you, Rosiva. So we're now moving on to the next part of our presentation, where we will situate our current research project in the wider context of Canadian and Albertan immigration. Canada is an extremely appealing immigrant destination, and immigration numbers have been increasing for the past 2 decades. In 2017, the Canadian government announced its aim to significantly increase the number of permanent residents to Canada in order to combat an aging workforce and the decline of working-age adults. The division of gender among newcomers is almost half and half, with slightly more female immigrants. Most immigrants in 2019 to Canada were from India, followed by China, Philippines, and the USA. Immigrants have high rates of education, thereby increasing the Canadian talent pool. Almost 50% of all immigrants have a BA degree or higher, compared to less than 25% of the Canadian-born population. Children of immigrants have higher university completion rates than children of Canadians, 41% versus 24%. Closing the immigrant wage gap would boost Canada's annual GDP by as much as 2.5%, or about $5 billion. Next slide, please. Alberta has the 3rd largest number of newcomers after Ontario and Quebec. In 2017, in the urban centers Edmonton and Calgary, 31% of the working population were born outside of Canada, and this number is expected to increase to 43% by 2036. In contrast, in more rural areas, 12% of the workers were foreign-born in 2017, and that number is expected to increase to 18% in 2036. The Alberta government at this point plans to settle 40,000 newcomers in rural communities by 2024. Next slide, please. So what are some of the specific challenges faced by newcomers to Canada? Newcomers face high rates of unemployment as well as underemployment in spite of their high levels of education and often decades of experience in their field, which is mainly due to lack of recognition of foreign credentials and experience, or high barriers to recertify or retrain in Canada. As a result, newcomers often find that they are forced to work in jobs for which they are overqualified for a very low wage. Working in these entry-level positions may provide them with Canadian work experience, but it may not qualify them to work in their field of expertise. Newcomers face language and communication barriers. While many newcomers have high proficiency of English, other communication barriers can limit their integration, such as intercultural communication and cultural differences in terms of workplace culture. Newcomers face sometimes open, sometimes hidden discrimination and racism, at times depending on their other identity markers, also from their own community. Unless they join family or friends in Canada, many newcomers encounter many levels of isolation in terms of their social contacts, common cultural traditions and celebrations, shared experiences, etc. Finding appropriate housing can be very challenging for many newcomers due to the lack of Canadian references, costs. For example, many landlords will ask for additional month's rent as security, source of income, or due to scammers. Transportation can be a challenge for newcomers depending on their location. It can be very difficult for newcomers to purchase their own vehicle due to a lack of Canadian credit history, source of income, and cost. Childcare can also be very costly, but without childcare, it is often not possible for newcomers to work. At the same time, since many newcomers find themselves working in low-wage jobs, they may struggle to pay for childcare. Different cultures have different medical systems, and the Canadian Western medical system may be intimidating or inappropriate for some newcomers. This may apply, for example, to the Western concept of mental health or to women's health. Other specific challenges faced by newcomers include the lack of understanding how the Canadian system works, disconnected services. Some newcomers may not fit into specific categories and they may not receive the services they need, or they no longer qualify for specific services. Next slide, please. While many advocates in Canada are calling for a clearer picture of who is contracting COVID-19 and how it affects them, the Public Health Agency of Canada is currently still considering the possibility of collecting more demographic data related to the disease. We know, for example, from public health officials in the US that Black communities are disproportionately affected by COVID-19. Advocates say that the situation here in Canada will be very similar, albeit on a smaller scale. Additional demographic data would allow for a better response and help those people at higher risk. At this point, Canada only gathers data about people who test positive for the disease, including age and gender. At the same time, it is evident that race does play a factor in the development and social impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, and we know that specific minorities such as the Black and Indigenous communities are at higher risk due to a range of factors, and we are also seeing a concerning increase of anti-Asian racism in Canada. Next slide, please.
Thank you, Miriam. So recently, there's a notable shift in the focus of research on newcomers and newcomer experiences settling in Canada. So we can see an increase of interest in the impact of newcomer settlement experiences on their well-being and mental health, as well as a shift toward providing better support for specific newcomer groups. For example, the integration of refugee children into the Canadian school system, or to provide medical care to newcomers who may be illiterate in their own language and therefore face barriers when communication with medical staff. One of the limitations of the current body of research is that roughly only about half of all newcomers use service providers during their settlement process. Much of the current research and knowledge we have on newcomers stems from research conducted with newcomers who do access services. So the problem is that we don't really know a lot about the other half of newcomers who do not access these services. Next slide, please. This is where our research project comes in. So Understanding Newcomer Experiences of Inclusion is a 2-year community-based research project funded by the Government of Alberta through the Settlement, Integration and Language Projects Grants Program. This project seeks to examine newcomers' experiences of settlement, integration, and inclusion, and how these impact newcomer well-being. The intent is to find solutions to challenges faced by newcomers to Canada regarding their settlement and integration. Existing knowledge on newcomer settlement experiences and well-being is mostly from the perspective of service providers, but little research has yet to capture the perspective of newcomers themselves. So this is where our project comes in, and the Understanding Newcomer Experiences of Inclusion research project aims to fill this gap by creating new qualitative and quantitative knowledge of newcomer settlement experiences and personal well-being in Alberta. So this also brings us back to the earlier article that I brought up in terms of having the lack of COVID data in terms of Indigenous populations during the land acknowledgement. So in this article, they talked about how hard it was to track how COVID has specifically been Indigenous communities and how there's actually been a lot of underreporting. And this happens because many institutions don't want to ask about race because it's an awkward question. A quote from that article that I mentioned is that it's, quote, almost impossible for any racialized community to seek accountability for poor outcomes or services based on racial discrimination. So we've also encountered this problem when administering the survey. How do you ask participants about their race in a way that feels appropriate? Asking someone to categorize themselves and fit their identity in a box might be very uncomfortable, but at the same time, it's very important. The way that we approached this question was to ask survey participants if they identified as a member of a visible or racial minority. So this way we could separate our data into racialized individuals and non-racialized individuals and analyze the data this way. So next slide, please. So since the beginning of this project in the summer of 2019, we've been very busy. First of all, we were initially conducting a review of academic and grey literature on newcomers and well-being. Afterwards, we created the online survey and reached out to organizations and agencies who work with newcomers in various capacities. And then in November of 2019, our survey was posted online, and we added survey versions in translated languages such as Cantonese, Punjabi, French, Spanish, and Tagalog. Afterwards, we began to conduct interviews and focus groups in 2020. And as you might have guessed, that interviews and focus groups has come to a halt due to COVID-19 pandemic. And so this has really impacted our data collection. So we've considered our options and we'll move our qualitative data collection, so the focus groups and the interviews, we'll move these online to platforms such as Zoom or other video chatting platforms to be able to conduct these focus groups. And so our goal is to complete our data by the end of September 2020, but depending on the uptake of survey and focus groups, we may extend this by an extra month or so. That's kind of still up in the air at this point. So after our data analysis in the fall, we will write the report and make it publicly available, and then also host a webinar similar to this one to share our findings in early 2021. So in the next slide, here is the numbers on who's been completing our survey. So we launched the survey and then we analyzed who's been taking it or not. And so at first, we were very disappointed when we began receiving spam surveys that weren't legit. This was very concerning to us, but actually it turns out that this is not a bad number because even though only 52% of these surveys were legitimate, when you look at other online surveys, the average completion rate is 33%. So actually we're doing not too bad compared to the average. So we've also completed 4 focus groups in total so far, as well as several individual interviews with people. So some folks requested individual interviews for confidentiality reasons. So in the next slide, in our outreach to reach as many diverse newcomers across Alberta as possible, we are encountering specific challenges. In order to have data which is representative of all newcomer communities, including small communities, it is vital to us to reach to individuals who may be difficult to reach for a number of reasons. So that could be because of marginalization, visibility, concerns about protection of privacy or language barriers, etc. So, there might be many reasons why folks aren't able to access that. So to connect with such communities and individuals is time-consuming and challenging, and it usually occurs through word-of-mouth references. So due to these barriers and obstacles, many of the newcomers we hope to connect with are still underrepresented in our project, but we hope that we will be able to choose some of the gaps as we move ahead in our research. In the next section of the webinar, we'll look specifically at the preliminary findings based on the data that we've collected so far, and we'll provide an overview on who our participants are and some of the demographic data they provided. Next, we will look at the connection between specific external life circumstances and personal well-being, as well as how stress affects these factors. And afterwards, we'll briefly discuss what we've heard so far in our focus groups and interviews and how that correlates with our data findings. Right, so next slide.
Thank you, Rosiva. Corresponding with other data on newcomer demographics, the majority of participants in our project are relatively young. 18% are between the ages of 18 to 24, while 35% are between the ages of 25 to 34, and 34% are between 35 to 44 years old. The majority of our participants are female with 57%, while 42% are male, and 1% identifies as non-binary or third gender. A little less than half, 45% of our participants, self-identify as part of a visible or racial minority. Next slide, please. The largest number of our participants indicate that they came to Canada as a family member of a principal immigrant. The other common categories, of course, are individual principal immigrants, followed by student visa. The majority of our participants have been in Canada between 0 to 1 year, followed closely by 1 to 3 years. For the purpose of our study, we define newcomer as anybody who has been new to Canada for up to 10 years. Corresponding with other demographic data available on newcomers, the majority of our participants are of Asian origin, followed by Africa and North America. Next slide, please. As we already know from other data sources, the majority of newcomers to Canada have above average levels of higher education. We know from Canadian census data that almost 50% of immigrants have at least a BA degree. Of our participants, 27% hold a bachelor's degree, while 19% hold an advanced degree such as a master's or a doctorate. In comparison, less than 25% of Canadian-born citizens have a BA and only 5% have an advanced degree. In comparison, 31% of our participants earn less than $25,000 a year, with a total of 43% earning less than $34,000 a year. 43% of our participants earn between $35,000 to $99,000 a year, with 11% also earning over $75,000 a year. In 2015, Canada's poverty line for a family of 2 adults and 2 children was at $37,000 across Canada, or $40,000 in Alberta. According to our data, 35% of newcomers live below the poverty line in comparison to 9.5% of the Canadian population. In 2019, Alberta was still one of the provinces with the highest median after-tax income of just a little bit over $53,000, counting both individuals and families. The next slide, please. Existing literature clearly indicates that wealth and income is divided along racial lines. Building on this, we looked specifically at any notable differences between individuals who self-identified as racialized persons and non-racialized individuals. As you can see from these 2 charts, there are some interesting differences between racialized and non-racialized individuals in employment. The left chart indicates that more non-racialized individuals are employed and also more non-racialized individuals who are students. On the chart to the right, we can see that more racialized individuals are actively looking for work while employed full-time, part-time, or working multiple part-time jobs than non-racialized individuals. These findings suggest that the issue of race plays a significant role in the workplace, both in respect of employment, as well as in terms of how satisfied a worker is with their place or type of employment. Next slide, please.
Okay, so this is our second poll. So this is going to be a multiple choice poll, and you'll have about a minute to answer. Okay, great. Thank you so much, everyone, for voting. And so the results that we have, so the question was, what are some of your main concerns in terms of barriers to newcomers in the future? So difficulty finding employment, 83% of folks chose that option. And then afterwards, there was financial cutbacks in terms of services as a result of COVID-19. And then we had impact of COVID, such as increased racism, and then lack of services in rural communities as the last one. And then in the other box, you could have filled that out, but I can't see where the answers are. So if you want to write that down somewhere else so we can see what you meant by other, we'd love to know what you have to say. So thank you so much for sharing with us.
And then we move on to the next slide. In order to go beyond simply looking at differences in experiences, we connect demographic data of our participants with indicators of personal well-being and stress to measure the direct impact specific circumstances and experiences have on a person's life. So what is personal well-being? Why is it significant? And how do we measure personal well-being in this study? There are, of course, a wide range of specific definitions of personal well-being, some of which include spiritual aspects, but in very general terms, subjective well-being refers to diverse and interconnected dimensions of physical, mental, and social well-being that extend beyond the traditional definition of health and can relate to aspects such as social satisfaction, a sense of accomplishment, or personal fulfillment. In this study, we are working with the Adult Personal Wellbeing Index, which has been developed as a standardized tool by an international team of researchers over many years and has been subjected to rigorous international testing, cross-validation, and peer review to ensure that the test has comparability and validity. It measures an individual's satisfaction in 7 life domains: standard of living, health, life achievements, personal relationships, personal safety, community connectedness, and future security. We have used this tool in a previous study, the Red Deer Welcoming and Inclusive Communities Needs Assessment from 2016, and we are using this index in the context of this research to examine and illustrate the direct subjective impact of life experiences and circumstances simply beyond statistical data. Next slide, please. So this is an example of what a PWI chart reveals. This chart represents all answers of all study participants with respect to their personal well-being. The blue line in the middle indicates the mean personal well-being index, which on average is usually slightly above 70 points. In this chart, we can see how in some aspects the PWI is higher, such as with respect to health, personal relationships, and safety, which indicates that individuals experience higher levels of satisfactions in these areas of their lives. Considering that our participants are newcomers and their specific contexts from which they emigrated to Canada, it is perhaps understandable that health and safety would be experienced as positive in Canada. In comparison, in the domains of standard of living, achievements in life, and community and future security, our participants rate well below the average PWI. What does this suggest? If we consider the economic setback and disappointments of many newcomers who came to Canada for better opportunities, as well as their lack of isolation, it is not surprising that these are the domains in which our participants experience the lowest levels of satisfaction. Next slide, please. So first, let's do a very straightforward analysis of how external circumstances are reflected in an individual's PWI. Here we are looking at how an individual's financial needs are directly linked to their PWI. Clearly, individuals who feel that they're earning enough to meet their financial needs experience an above average level of personal well-being, while those who struggle financially experience a considerably lower level of personal well-being. Next slide, please. Let's use the PWI to understand how levels of income directly impact our personal well-being. Not surprisingly, those with high levels of income above $100,000 a year or more have very high levels of PWI, and individuals with very low levels of income, less than $25,000 a year, experience low levels of PWI. Interestingly, while those with income levels between $25,000 to $75,000 a year have very similar and average PWI levels, there is a notable dip in the PWI of those who earn between $75,000 to $99,000 a year. This, for example, is one of those findings in our preliminary data analysis which deserves further investigation in order to examine other potentially contributing factors. Next slide, please. Now let's look at another PWI chart, this one by age groups. As we can see from this chart, the age groups of 18 to 24 and 65 to 74 have the highest PWI rates, while the age groups between 25 to 64 have considerably lower rates, although it appears to respectively improve with age. The potential reason for this distribution could be that the youngest age group is economically and in terms of social connections, perhaps a group that has not been as established in their place of origin, and they therefore may find that they have greater economic prospects in Canada. The oldest age group are seniors who may be financially secure, who may have a social network of an extended family, and who may no longer face the challenges of the workplace. The age groups between 25 to 44 are likely those with the heaviest burden in terms of economic setbacks, unrecognized credentials or previous experiences, family responsibilities towards children and or elderly family members, while also having to make the cultural adjustments. Next slide, please. Another standardized tool that we use in our survey is to measure levels and sources of stress in individuals. We would expect to see a direct link between PWI levels and stress levels as it is represented in this chart. Individuals who experience very low levels of stress have very high levels of PWI, while those with high and extremely high levels of stress experience very low levels of PWI. At the same time, individuals who experience an average degree of stress experience an average degree of personal well-being. Next slide, please. Building on this point, let's have a look at the sources of stress experienced by our participants. Not surprisingly, the most significant source of stress is employment status, directly followed by the work situation. Two other points, which are perhaps also not surprising, but nevertheless point to the significance of these aspects in the lives of newcomers, are the role of loneliness, lack of family and community support, as well as discrimination. Next slide, please. What is the relationship between gender and stress? In this chart, we are looking at specific life stressors and the difference in stress experienced by men and women. Men are indicated in the red columns, while women are blue. First, it is notable that in almost all areas, women experience considerably higher levels of stress in comparison to men. The areas in which men appear to experience slightly higher levels of stress are personal and family safety, including family abroad, and personal relationships. Interestingly, discrimination is experienced very similar by both genders, while an individual's own health problems and conditions are a level of higher concern for women. Next slide, please. We were interested in differences in stress levels between racialized individuals and non-racialized individuals. In this chart, the red column represents racialized individuals, while the beige column indicates non-racialized individuals. What is immediately notable is that very and extremely high levels of stress are experienced more by racialized individuals. This is also reflected in the PWI scores, which clearly indicate that the PWI score is higher among those individuals who report no or low levels of stress, and lower PWI scores among more stressed individuals. Next slide, please. Here we would like to return to our previous discussion on the PWI. We had established that among Western nations, a PWI score in the mid-70s is considered an average score, while scores in the lower 60s or even 50s are considered to be strong indicators for very low levels of personal well-being. We were interested in learning more about our participants who had particularly low levels of PWI and in which areas of their lives they indicated to have high levels of stress. In this analysis, we can see that in some areas are specifically notable. The blue column indicates the results of the entire group of participants, while the red columns represent only those individuals with very low PWI scores. Here, we noted the areas of stress in particular: personal and family safety, including abroad, loneliness, lack of family or community support, and discrimination. While discrimination is indicated as a stressor by all our participants, overall, among those with very low PWI scores, the score of discrimination as a stressor is almost twice as high as that of the average participant. Next slide, please. Now let's have a look at the results of our questions about the use of services by our participants. We know from existing research that less than half of all newcomers to Canada use services aimed at newcomers, but we know very little about the reasons of why they are not accessing services. This is one of the reasons why we are trying to connect with newcomer communities who have not used any of the services to better understand how their needs can be met. The burgundy color in this chart indicates the answer, have never used this service, and the results in this chart indicate indeed that the only services which have been used with some frequency by our participants are services for immigrants and refugees, as well as for children. Other services, such as specifically for LGBTQ individuals or seniors, have been very rarely used, although this could also reflect the proportion of this population in comparison to the majority. Next slide, please. When we look at other services which are available to the wider community but are also used by the general public and newcomers, we can see that significant role of public libraries along with public transportation. Notable is also the somewhat frequent use of emergency help, which includes food and shelter or protection from family violence. These results in our questions around services are very intriguing, and we do not yet understand enough what aspects contribute to whether or not individuals use which services or choose not to use them. We have learned from our focus groups and interviews that there appears to be a lack of knowledge about available services, as well as a lack of understanding regarding which services provide specific programs. Another aspect we learned from our participants is the potential barrier of transportation, specifically for individuals who live outside of the city center. It can be also particularly challenging for newcomers to access services if they have to look after small children. But as we have said, there are still many unknown factors in relation to service usage, which we hope to explore in more detail in our future interviews and focus groups.
Great, thank you, Miriam. And just a reminder to folks, if you want to have more time to look at those slides, etc., we'll be posting the PowerPoint and those slides at a later time, so you can have a closer look at them, but we're kind of wanting to just give you the highlights and some main points. So just to give you a summary, so Canada is keen to attract more newcomers, largely to sustain our workforce. Yet the current system which draws newcomers to Canada is not providing a smooth connection between newcomers and jobs. These skilled worker programs accept newcomers based off of their experiences and their credentials. But the problem is that once newcomers arrive to Canada, their credentials and experiences are not recognized, and they might find themselves in economically, emotionally, and psychologically very difficult circumstances. In addition to isolation and loneliness, newcomers may potentially face financial hardship, difficulty finding appropriate housing, and then also having language and communication barriers, as well as facing discrimination and racism. We're not saying that all newcomers have these experiences, but as you can tell from our data, a very concerning number of them do. So in correspondence with census data, our data indicates that the newcomer population in Alberta is made up of indicate young place. Our PWI and stress analysis clearly indicates the considerably lower levels of well-being and higher levels of experience considerably higher levels of stress over non-racialized newcomers. Clayton, yes, we're on slide 36, just so you're aware. Yes. So among those particularly low PW scores, there are typically high stressors. Another connection that we found through both our data and in focus groups is that many newcomers experience a double minority factor. So for example, newcomers who are part of gender and sexual minority population may face hardships in the wider Albertan context. For newcomers may turn to their own ethnocultural communities for support. Newcomers who might face this because of their status so that we can know more about how minority status very fun, interesting. Not yet have all the answers available at the and very clear from our data is the link between personal well-being and high levels of stress, as well as employment and lack of and high levels of stress. And so the lack of fulfilling employment opportunities for newcomers is not only an economic concern. In our study, we don't yet fully are frequented by which newcomers specific seeking out services.
You're cutting out right now.
Okay, why don't I take over the slides then?
Okay, what slide should we be on?
Sure, I'm just starting, Miriam.
Okay, slide 37.
Okay.
Yeah, okay, I'll take over from here then. Our data collection at this point is planned to continue until the end of September 2020. Our goal is to collect at least another 1,000 surveys and to conduct another 5 focus groups and or 15 to 20 interviews. It is specifically important to us to speak with as many diverse newcomers as possible to reflect the highly diverse experiences of immigrants, refugees, and migrants. While it is very difficult to reach some of the populations, we would like to hear about the experiences from minorities such as the LGBTQ community, those who live with HIV, those newcomers who may be undocumented or experience homelessness. If you personally know anybody, we would be very grateful if you could please let them know of our interest. We have undergone a stringent ethics review and have put in place strict guidelines to protect our participants' privacy and anonymity. We will only use an online platform which will fully protect our participants' privacy. Next slide, please. We would like to ask you to help us to further increase the numbers of our project participants, simply because the more participants we have, the more reflective this data will be of the experiences of all newcomers in Alberta. With strong data, we can also offer more significant insights and provide recommendations. We ask you to please promote our online survey. If you have not previously been involved with our project, here are the criteria for survey participants. So in the online survey, participants need to be at least 18 years of age. They need to be a newcomer to Canada for up to 10 years and currently reside in Alberta. And after this presentation, we will also send you a follow-up email where we will provide the link and more information about the online survey. So we have also put together a short note that you could circulate in your newsletter or on social media, and we would be really very grateful if you could share this information with your newcomer community. We are also looking for participants in our focus groups and interviews, and due to the current crisis, we will of course conduct everything online. The groups or interviews take somewhere between 60 to 90 minutes, depending on the number of participants. And this form of data collection allows us to go into depth about individual experiences of newcomers. Every participant will receive a $25 gift card, and we also offer a financial incentive for individuals who are willing to organize a group, for example, online, as well as for persons who are willing to function as a translator. We're really very flexible in doing our best to accommodate anybody who wants to put together a focus group. And so if you have any ideas around that, please be in contact with us, and we will see what we can do to support you in doing that. Next slide, please. So concluding in this webinar, we looked at some general data on newcomers to Canada and Alberta to contextualize our project. We provided information on the intent of the project and how our research fits into the wider current body of ongoing research. We looked at the work we have done so far, at what we have learned so far from the data we have collected, and we have also gone over the next steps that we are anticipating to do over the next few months. Next slide, please. And now we have, well, roughly 10 minutes for Q&A. At the same time, we would also like to ask you here to click on the link that Rie will provide you in the chat box, which will take you to our feedback form. We would be really very grateful if you could take the time. It shouldn't take very long, maybe 2-3 minutes, to give us feedback on our webinar and our research project. It will help us to tailor our final report and our concluding webinar to your needs and what interests you specifically. So this is really very important to us. Thank you. And now we can move on to the questions you may have.
So I was watching some questions, and there are a few questions. I have one. Do you think the data collection will be compromised because not all newcomers have internet access or are familiar with the new platforms?
Absolutely, that's a very good and very valid question, and there's definitely a possibility. Direct face-to-face contact is usually preferable. So also, for example, for newcomers who attend service providers, if they can hear from somebody who they know face-to-face about our ongoing research, there's a certain rapport that has already been established between the newcomer and the service provider. So newcomers usually feel more comfortable than also doing our online survey, for example, or connecting with us to do a focus group. So yes, unfortunately, I consider that as a possibility, that it may be more difficult to reach individuals, yes.
Another one. How can programs like local immigration partnerships provide insights to inclusionary activities, municipalities' initiatives, policies, and practices to foster inclusion?
Well, for starters, I personally feel that the local immigration partnerships are extremely important, specifically because the newcomers who live in more rural communities away from the large city centers are so dependent on having connections, and also in terms of accessing services, but also in terms of making connections with other newcomers who have similar experiences. So that it is very important that these local partnerships exist. As far as the question goes, how we can, sorry, would you mind repeating the question? I think it was about how we can improve integration.
Yeah, how can they provide insights to activities, municipality initiatives, and policies to foster inclusion?
Okay, thank you. I think an important step that we can take in the future is collaborating with existing agencies. I think there is still a lot of overlap between programs. Also, a lot of agencies don't know what other agencies are offering. And so I think the more we collaborate, the more comprehensive the services will be that are accessible to newcomers, and different organizations and agencies have different strengths and focus on different aspects. So the more we can collaborate and support each other in the important work that we all do, the more accessible all these services will be to newcomers. We have certainly heard from newcomers, as well as from service providers that we spoke with, that they are often not even aware that other services exist. And so unless they actually get a direct referral from one service provider to another service that is offered by somebody else, they may never know about it. So I think this working closely together and collaborating is a really important step that we still need to work on.
Great. I have a question about the survey. On average, how long does it take to complete the survey?
Mm-hmm. Good question. That really totally depends on the individual. We've had, to be honest, we've had people that have completed it in 5 minutes, and we've had people where the time indicates it took them 4.5 hours. But I think that what happens here is that people start completing the survey, and then maybe they're interrupted or they walk away, and then they return to it at a later point in time. So we have the survey available in English and also in translations. And I would say for those who have who either complete the survey in their own language or who have good English proficiency, usually it does then take no longer than 10 minutes. Most people complete it in less than that. I would say the average time is probably somewhere between 10 to 15 minutes maximum. And as we've said, they will receive a $10 gift card for it as well.
Great. I have lots of questions coming in also. Do you have any data to share related to the numbers of newcomer adults who access adult education like English classes. Do you have anything in your research incorporating that view?
I can't speak to that honestly off the top of my head. We definitely ask questions about around accessing language services amongst the services that are offered by service providers, but I don't have the exact numbers off the top of my head. But I can definitely look at that, and I can include that information in the follow-up email that we will be sending out to you. Oh, I'm sorry, Ria,
your was muted.
Audio. Okay.
Yeah. So how do you think cultural standards affect the comfort level of newcomers regarding seeking out and engaging in services? Yeah, that's a really good question.
That's a very good question. Yeah, what we have heard from people that we spoke with in our interviews and in our focus groups, it does seem that people naturally tend to turn towards people that they may already know here and basically ask them if they can point them in the right direction. Very rarely have we ever had somebody who was so on top of things and well prepared that they already researched service providers even from their home country. Most of the time they seem to come to Canada. In some instances, depending on where they land, they may actually get a little booklet that provides them with important information in terms of where to go and how things work here in Canada, but that does not happen in all big airports across Canada. That seems to be a hit and miss experience. So some people may arrive here at the airport and they have no idea where to go, unless there happens to be one of the service providing organizations that sometimes seem to be at the airport to hand out flyers and information. Sometimes people are really more or less left to their own devices. And so I think there's a number of things that come into play here, but I think perhaps also not even knowing that these services exist here, what services are available, what to look for. I think a lot of this sort of really only comes to the forefront of one's awareness once they have actually landed here, and there are these millions of things that they need to figure out. So again, one of the things that we have learned from our interviews and focus groups is that people would really appreciate to receive this information basically upfront. So whether it is already via email while they're still in their country of origin, or at the very latest when they land at the airport. So that is definitely also going to be a recommendation that we will make, that this information really needs to be out there. It needs to be made readily available, and it also needs to be very inclusive. So really there should be anything in there, from how do you find a rental place, to how to watch out for scammers, to how to set up a cell phone, all these details that people just don't know where to go to when they land here. I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, I know it's like about less than 2 minutes to go, but I think I'll just ask 2 more questions and wrap up quickly. Sure. How do attendees go about setting up a or participating in the focus group or interview? Can they send an email? Yes.
Yeah, so basically send us an email and then we take it from there, and we work very closely with whomever wants to organize the group, whoever wants to participate in an interview. So every situation is different, and we basically work with every individual situation, and we try our very best to accommodate interested participants in any way possible.
Okay, I might have left the question, the toughest question maybe. But how would you distinguish between ethnicity and race? So this is around, can you look at data that speaks to one's ethnic identity or ethnic heritage rather than race, incorporated into your survey or research?
Well, I think we could probably fill an entire lecture on that topic. There are a lot of different perspectives and perceptions these days on ethnicity versus race. What is the appropriate term to use? For the purpose of our research, we simply concluded that it was important to talk about race. And so to us, technically, race and ethnicity are very closely linked. However, race is something that in our interpretation, more people will understand what we mean than when we say ethnicity. And so this is a bit of a, it's a very complex and complicated topic, and it's not easy to tease apart, but we were keeping in mind how can we communicate what we mean to our participants so that it's not ambiguous and so that people understand what we mean. And what is also important to us is we are asking people to self-identify whether they feel they are part of a visible minority or a racialized community. We don't want to assign those labels. But as we can see from our data, it is a very important question to ask. It needs to be addressed because there is a clear racial divide in so many aspects of our lives. And by using a perhaps less offensive term such as ethnicity, we may be skirting around some of these really difficult issues. So I agree. I also find the term race very difficult. But at the same time, as we can see from our data, it's an important differentiation to make.
And if I can also jump in, I don't know if you can hear me, if I'm still cutting out or not. But I just wanted to share the definition of race that the Center for Race and Culture uses. The definition that we use is that race is a relational and dynamic category of economic interests over groups of people. It assigns values to certain groups based on boundaries that the dominant people's race does have impacts when we want to learn more about. So yeah.
Yeah, you might be a little bit
on
and off there.
Okay.
Yeah, but definitely you can attach that piece definitely to the material you'll be uploading on the website.
Sure.
But yes, so we'll wrap up. Sorry, we're a couple minutes over now, but thank you everybody for sticking around. And thank you for your questions. I have posted also the Miriam's email, and you can also email what's your email info?
Oh, it's projects at cfrac.com.
Yeah, that's
so
the one
again,
I have posted on the answers.
Okay.
Yes.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Well, we just want to say thank you everyone for your interest and for joining us today for this webinar. We are very grateful. We will be in touch again and we will keep you informed, and I will send you all a follow-up email afterwards. So also if you have any more questions around how to connect with us, what the participation in the interviews or and the focus groups entail, please be in touch. And we would be most grateful if you could please also distribute the information on our survey to your network. Again, I will send you the information. And other than that, we hope you will have a lovely and safe rest of the day. And thank you everyone for your time again.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. Lovely. Yeah. Thanks for letting us this time.